All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Recovery Summit presentation, Integrating Cultural Awareness and Substance Use Treatment for Black Boys, Men, and Fathers. This webinar is part of a series hosted annually by St. Clair County Community Mental Health during the month of September, which is National Recovery Month. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded on the CMH YouTube channel for future reference. Please feel free to use the chat box for all questions or comments. Our presenter will be answering questions as time allows. Continuing education credits are offered for today's presentation. If you are requesting professional credits, you must remain on the webinar the entire time and complete the survey at the end of the presentation to receive credit. I just want to welcome again everyone and our presenter today, Cole Williams. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here this morning as it's been a and a busy morning so far. But again, my name is Cole Williams. I'm excited to be here to talk about a really important subject matter that is near and dear to my heart. And so one of the things I first want to preference is that I am not a licensed clinician, but I am a father and I am a practitioner doing this work that serve young Black boys and fathers. So I want to be clear as the lens that I will be sharing my perspective from. And so the title of my workshop today is Integrating Cultural Awareness and Substance Use Treatment for Black Boys, Men, and Fathers. And I am the executive director of a nonprofit called the Delta Project. And the Delta Project provides services for young men that are involved in our juvenile justice system. One of the things I want to just point out that we will cover, or two of the things we'll cover today, I'll try my best to cover for you, is there's at least three unique cultural factors that influence substance use treatment outcomes for Black boys and men and fathers, and also to demonstrate the ability to modify any existing treatment plans to incorporate cultural awareness and strategies, specifically to support Black boys and males across different age lifespans. And so I'm really excited to be here. One of the things that I enjoy having the opportunity to do is do keynotes and workshops and trainings that specifically serve families, practitioners, clinicians, folks that are involved in our juvenile justice system, our child welfare system, in terms of how do we engage and serve and support Black boys and Black men. And one of the big things that I really appreciate is having the opportunity to not only provide this as a training, but I am still boots on the ground. I still have the amazing opportunity to work very closely with young men who are involved in our child welfare system, our juvenile justice system, our community mental health systems, our education system, and even our criminal justice system. So I spend a lot of time with men that are in these spaces. And unfortunately, the men that I serve are not always on the positive side of our systems. And so I just want to encourage you that today I'm going to do my best to be transparent, to be honest, to talk specifically from my experience, but also the work that I have been doing to support Black and brown boys and men. And my hope is that this workshop will also support you in engaging in the work that you do, but most importantly, have an awareness of why we have to be um, conscious and intentional about how we provide services to young men of color. So we're going to get started. So the Delta Project, again, is a project that I have had the opportunity to birth. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Delta Project in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And again, we provide support to young men that are involved in our JJ system specifically, or at risk at being involved in our juvenile justice system. And one of the things that we have often seen with serving young men that are involved in the juvenile justice system across the state or in Kent County currently is that many of these young men have cross-system involvement. They've involved in many of our systems, but one of the systems that I often hear most about is our mental health system. And so today I will be sharing from that space and lens, but our programming really supports young men in terms of telling their stories, giving them the tools to be able to do that, but also support young fathers that are involved in the systems, and also engaging young women through healthy choices and healthy living. So these are just some of the programs you can check out when you visit the Delta Project. So one of my questions that originally started this whole thing for me is, how do I become something I don't see? And that's a beautiful question, right? It's a very universal question, but it's a very important question that young men are asking. How do I become something I don't see? And I think that's really important to think about, when we think about how we provide services to young men of color, when we think about how we see them, when we think about how society views them and sees them, that question really rings true, and it shows up in most of, if not all of the work that we do. So how do a young person become what they don't see? And how do they connect with services? How do they trust practitioners who provide these services? If they don't necessarily have a positive experience, narrative, or story within their community sector that highlights why this question is important, right? And so these are just some of the young men that we've had the opportunity to work alongside inside our juvenile detention center. One of the things we also provide is a young dad program for young fathers. And this is just a group of dads at our podcast studio where we share and talk and train young fathers to walk alongside other young dads. So my why for this work, why do I do this work? Why did I show up every day to this work? And I hope, like many of you, your why is connected to something bigger or greater than yourself. And so what I'd love for you to do is just take a few minutes and in the chat, if you can, plug in your why. And I hope that in the next minute or two, what I'd like for folks to be able to observe and see is that there are so many of you that are doing this outside of just one particular reason. Our why is connected to something often most near and dear to our hearts. So if you have an opportunity, I'd love for you to put in the chat, what is your why for the work that you do? I don't know where people are coming from, but I'm really curious to see what your whys are. Why do you do what you do? For me, my why is my sons. And the picture here that you see, I'm in the back with the white tie on. I actually have very long hair and no gray. I was 27 at the time, and the sons that you see in this picture are sons from our child welfare system through the abuse and neglect foster care system, our community mental health, which is a space that I found myself down as a single dad, and boys and sons that were involved in the juvenile justice system. So not only am I coming to you with experience from the work sector, but I'm also coming to you from a lived experience father. So some of the whys here, being a part of something bigger than me. Thank you, Heather. Wanting to help break those stereotypes people have about these youth being bad. These are kids just wanting to be loved, acceptance, and guidance. Thank you. Lived experience. To honor my brother. To help others gain skills to be successful in their own lives. To use my voice to advocate for others that society silences, to improve my community, my family, and myself. And the last one I would say, see a need, feel a need. I love that. When you see a need, feel it. So as we go through the training today, if you have an opportunity, really take a moment to read through some of the whys. And those of you who participated, I really appreciate you sharing. So one of the things that I like to highlight as it relates to my why in this work is really centered around the cycle of mental health, foster care, and delinquency. And this is really a framework of my sons who found themselves in a host of agencies, residential treatment facilities and services, foster homes that they were involved in prior to entering into my home. And then we find ourselves involved in the criminal justice system. Here are our mental health providers that provided support for our family. And these are also prescribed medications, so antidepressants and psycho medications. I think I'm saying that incorrectly. But these are some of the medications that my son showed up in my care with, Abilify, Vyvanse, Lexapro, Concerta, Ritalin, Adderall, and lithium, right? And so I think why I keep showing up in these spaces and why I keep asking to have a space to talk about Black boys particularly is because I was in a home raising sons across all lines when it comes to our systems, trying to figure out how to provide them with support. And then it dawned on me oftentimes than not that I didn't have the skills, knowledge, and ability either to be able to really support the kids that was in my care, right? And so I learned a lot along the way. And here's what my larger family looked like. One thing I often tell people is that we did not all live together. People are like, well, man, that's a huge family. We did not all live together at the same time. My youngest currently is 25, and he is currently in prison. And my youngest is 25. My oldest is 30. And so, this is the me as a dad at 27 years old, trying to figure out how do you support young men who are involved in our systems who look like me. Right. And before I sort of move into the presentation, one of the things that I love sharing is an invitation by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. She's a justice doula, and I love this. It says an invitation to a brave space. So I'd like to read this. It says, "Together we will create a brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars. We have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We will call each other to more truth and love. We will have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side." And I think this is a really great invitation for all of the work that you all do when it comes to entering into spaces where you're serving families. And it takes a lot of courage and bravery to show up in your offices, to show up on virtual, to show up in spaces to talk about some of the most vulnerable things that you could possibly unpack with people that you often don't know. Right. And so for me, this training is really about how do we make sure that we're creating these spaces, not only within the service that we provide, but how do we also create these spaces within ourselves so it's mirrored out when you provide the services to the people that are most important in the work that you do. Right. And so one of the things that I'll focus a little bit on is to talk a little bit about identity theory. I love it, especially when I think about the young people and the men that I serve. And so I'll read this very quickly. Identity theory explains how people see themselves based on their social roles, like being a parent, worker, or friend. It says that how we identify with these roles influences how we behave. And I have had so much work with working with young people and men that this holds very, very true. And so one of the first questions I'll have for you, you don't have to necessarily answer in the chat, but just something to begin to think about. And maybe no, I'll take that back. Maybe we will answer this in the chat. How are the boys in your community? So when you think about the young men that you serve, when you think about the young men that you don't serve, when you think about the young men that you hear about, you read about, you see, when you think about the young man that's in your school, wherever this young person is, I want you to tell me, what are you hearing? How are they doing? And so that's my first question. Second question for you of the day is, how are the boys in your community doing? So you can add that to the chat. How are the boys doing in your community? Struggling to find where they belong in their community. They're hiding, masking a lot of depression and anxiety, struggling to fit in. I agree, vulnerable, misled, struggling to fit in, lots of judgments. They are struggling to find identity, lack of opportunities and resources, very vulnerable and challenged by social media, not so good, misled, needing more to do. It's really a broad spectrum. It depends on their home life, or if they've had a chance to have a mentor, etc. Most feel lost and alone, labeled negatively by systems having basic human needs, no positive role models, struggling to go against the grain and make positive choices, constantly in fight, flight, freeze mode. What I think is really interesting, right, is that everything you said is very universal to the conversations that we're all having across all systems. And so this African proverb rings very true. It says, children who are not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And I think this is such a powerful proverb because I absolutely think it speaks to what you just said. It absolutely speaks to what we're seeing is that children are doing all kinds of things to be embraced by their community. One of the top things I just read throughout the thread there is mentors. Again, how do I become something I don't see? If I don't see it, how can I be it? right? And so this is a reflection of what is happening to the adults. Where are the adults? Where the community? How are we braiding funding? How are we supporting our children? How are we really seeing and shaping the larger picture when we talk about the concept of a future, specifically, right, for the young men that are in our communities? So just to kind of go back to what many of you just described, some of the things that kind of pops up, right? No, I'm not even gonna say kind of. Some of the things that shows up for young men that they report and we see and we know is that Black boys and men fathers often are viewed as angry and aggressive. And I think what's really interesting is that if we just polled what you just described as happening in your community, there's no wonder why there might be challenges around emotions and feelings and aggression and anger, right? These attitudes mean that Black children are experiencing or at risk of harm, may not be seen as vulnerable or in need of protecting. And I think this is really important too, right? Because when we think about how we see Black boys, especially if the framework is centered around anger and aggression, fear, right? That also taps into our biases, and I think it leaves Black boys who become men too vulnerable and not protected. And one of the big words that I do a training on is really talking about adultification, and this concept and idea about seeing young children as older. Black children are seen as more an adult. Right. And so I'm going to just read off some of the stats. And I'm going to say one thing, these stats are going to feel very grim, right? And this is from the Child Center for Crisis to Connection in Detroit. And so this is some of the information that I've gathered from them and their amazing work in terms of really focusing in on Black and brown, on Black boys particularly. And so I just want to share a little bit of this, but I also want to say while I'm sharing these stats, I also want to note there are Black boys and Black men that are doing exceptionally well despite, right? And so although we have these grim narratives, there are also a whole other narrative that can really redefine how we can do better work, especially when we talk about how we support Black and brown boys. But for the sake of this training, I'm going to use some of the stats. And so some of this is from, again, the Children's Center in Detroit, the Crisis to Connection. And if you're not familiar with them, it's really important that you do. And so I'm just going to read some of this. It says, our Black boys in Detroit are in crisis. And I want to say, even if I took Detroit out and I put where your city is and I put my city, I think some of the same trajectories might show up. And so it says Black boys are disproportionately affected by implicit bias, systemic racism, and a lack of trauma-informed community support systems. They experience trauma at much higher rate than their white counterparts. So these are just some of the stats I'm going to share out, right? It says, compared to all other males, Black boys are 1.5 times more likely to receive in-school suspensions, 2.4 times more likely to receive out-of-school suspensions, 1.7 times more likely to receive expulsions. Nationally, Black men ages 30 to 34 are incarcerated at more times than 5 times the rate of white men. Nationally, in 99% of U.S. neighborhoods, Black boys in adulthood earn less than white men who grew up in households with similar incomes. Nationally, Black men 18 and over have the highest adjusted all-cause mortality rate and worst health statuses of any ethnic group sex in the U.S., right? And so I used to read these things and I oftentimes did not. No, that's not true. I would read these things and want to believe that these things aren't true. But as I started to do the work and have my own lived experience, I discovered that, you know what, these things are true and it is happening. And so one of the things I just want to talk about is how can providers do something completely different, right? And that could be very difficult for a lot of ways. So what we see, Black boys are more likely to be viewed as older, less innocent, and more culpable than others. And so there is this bias challenge that shows up all over the place. So here we're talking about schools, but it's not just in schools we're seeing some of these challenges around bias and disparities. We see it across the board. We know that disparities exist in access to and use of mental health services for boys and young men of color. We know this. This is very true. I can speak from being a father of raising Black boys. One of the big issues that came up is the idea of not being crazy, not feeling crazy, and the challenge around this concept, right? There's so much that's associated with the idea of being labeled. And one of the things I think is true now in 2024, we have a variety and an array and diverse services that really speak to the cultural competence or the cultural nature of therapy, and making sure that we are competent, making sure that we are providing services that fit um, young men and boys and fathers who are coming from vulnerable and resource savvy spaces. But one of the things that we also know is that therapy is still a very difficult conversation to have for many, right? And one of those reasons is the concept of not feeling or being mislabeled, and wanting to fit into the idea of what it means to be normal. And so, what we have to recognize is understanding the factors that influence engagement. For young men of color, prior experiences with service providers have caused trauma. And I think that sometimes it's very difficult to to process that, but to recognize that not every experience when you say therapy is going to feel like a very positive experience for someone, a young man who has had experiences with trauma. And I can't tell you how many times as a father I was told, well, let's get the kids in therapy. Let's get the boys in therapy. Let's get the boys in therapy. And I discovered that while I was doing my best to get them in therapy because that was required and that was needed for their trauma, right? Or their history. One of the things that dawned on me is that they didn't have a relationship or connection with some of the service providers. And although the service providers provided the service, it also did not align oftentimes with my son's beliefs that they needed therapy. And so here I am as a father, not having therapy myself, not necessarily buying into therapy either, right? And so I'm going to be super transparent as I share, because in my mind, I thought that no, you don't necessarily need therapy. Here's what we can do, right? I'm going to go to my church, I'm going to speak to my pastor, I'm going to do a variety of other things other than speak to somebody about my problems. And that's really important to note, especially when we have young men who are growing up in a culture where the concept of expressing yourself and talking about your feelings is not something that you do. You definitely don't have, my sons didn't have the language to talk about their feelings. And what was also interesting, and I was 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. I'm almost 35 years old before I had the opportunity to really talk about my own feelings and to talk about my own emotions. And so here I am raising sons, and I'm not giving them the tools to be able to talk about and express themselves. Where heck, I didn't know how to do it, right? And so, what I start seeing that was happening is the pathways to mental health care for my children. I saw them getting support when they found themselves in the criminal justice system, and the education system, and the foster care system. Therapy was something that popped up often when they found themselves in care, when we talked about their medication, when I talked about having my son in the juvenile detention center, and someone asked the nurse in the center, asking if he has medication, making sure that he gets the proper medication. Like, I'm constantly having these conversations around their mental health care, but still really not understanding how to really support them. And also, one of the things that I talk about, again, when we talk about how young men see themselves in these spaces, is that there was a lot of implicit bias. And so most of my sons had a lot of issues feeling like when they did sign up for therapy, when they did agree to go to therapy, one of the big challenges that they had was feeling like they weren't heard, that feeling like people didn't see them. Or better yet, one of the things that showed up oftentimes when I took my sons to a therapist is that the therapist didn't look like them. And so that was really a challenge for my sons, and I think even for my family. And I didn't necessarily, again, didn't really buy into the concept of therapy. I believe that there was a whole variety of other ways that I could support my sons, get them in sports, right? If I get them playing sports, that's going to, get some of the hostility and the anger out. And they'll be so tired that, like, this is the concept and the framework that I was operating out of. And so I think this rings very true when I had to really understand what some of those barriers were that was getting in the way of my son's care, but also my own, right? And so removing some of those barriers was really about, as clinicians and workers, how do you create a connection where there's trust? How do you create a space where folks feel like they're heard, that they're listened to? How do we shift from saying mental illness to mental wellness, right? That's a different framework, right? When I hear illness, I think of sick. My sons heard illness, that's what they thought of. They didn't think of um when I talked about mental illness, it didn't connect with when we talk about physical fitness. Like it didn't have the same kind of framework for them, but neither did it for me. Mental health, like when I thought about mental health, I thought about all the things that was associated to mental health. I thought about my own biases as it related to mental health and my framework that was created from my upbringing. And that you don't talk about your problems, right? And you definitely don't take your problems to a professional. You just don't do that, right? Because that's oftentimes sometimes where you learn from community. Well, community will tell you about the agency, and that's another big thing I have found that I really want agencies to understand. You do represent a larger system, right? And so when people enter into your spaces, one of the things that they come back with is what they learn, and they take that to their aunt, they take that to their brother, they take that to their cousin, and if they had a horrible experience when they entered into the agency or the organization from the first moment they came in contact with someone, they're going to carry that out into their community. They're going to share that, and so I tell people, let's go beyond a brochure. Brochures are great, and oftentimes people read it, some don't. Oftentimes, I never read a brochure. um, my what really framed it up for me is how what I experienced when I entered into the environment, what I experienced when I opened up my laptop and I had a virtual. What did I experience, right? And people really take that and move with that. I don't know about you, but I'm really big. I'm not going to name the restaurant, but there's a restaurant that does really good with oh man, not customer service. Customer service is one thing. I can't think of the word right now, but it's really about how you engage with people in spaces. And so I think that's really key in this work. How you show up in these spaces really does matter, right? What I witnessed, and again, here's my son's, is a picture of me with a little bit hair, a little bit longer hair than what you see right now. But this is something that I think really stood out for me. Therapeutic services provided from a system who removed my sons from their families, acting out behavior that led to more experiences with mental health clinicians. Being involved in the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system led to supportive services or lack thereof of mental health support. It's about accountability and justice now. The running narrative describes these young men as blank, 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 right? So whatever narrative that we have, that became a part of what, how services were provided to them, or how medications were shifted and changed that was provided to them. Placing these labels on them takes away their humanity and makes it easier for us to see them as inherently bad. I just read that earlier on in the chat, and no one ever asked about their life experiences, right? Or they asked about their life experiences, and then we got a new clinician. And then we had to tell that life experience over again. And then that clinician shifted into a new space. And then I had a new clinician. And so I found myself doing something that I really got overwhelmed with, is constantly connecting with people that left. Right. And of course, there's a variety of reasons why this work causes us to shift and grow and change. But it also has an impact on families too, and children. When they finally connect with a therapist, when they finally connect with an agency, when they finally connect, there's a shift. Maybe someone moves, maybe they move, right? And then we're expecting them to be able to comply and follow the plan that's created and written for them. And quite oftentimes than not, that's just not how it works, right? Just not how it works. So one of the other things I think is important just to point out is perception of stigma. Um, and that the idea is that we don't have stereotypes, and we do. And these are just some of the things I think is important for us to recognize. Providers will generalize boys and young men of color experiences. Providers will fail to understand the realities of boys and young men of color, right? And this is true. This is true, and it can be very hard to hear these things, but I think it's necessary in growth, right? Misdiagnoses. I think this also plays a huge role in what happens to young men of color. And I saw it happen with my sons being misdiagnosed very early on. No one recognizing that this was connected to trauma. Now I have a child that's on a medication that is unrelated to resolving their trauma, right? And that's the stereotype that's connected to my sons were bad. These boys are bad. These men are bad. They need to be all the things that we could add to that, right? And I think these get in the way of being able to support young people. I often reference this book. I think it's an amazing book. It's called Cool Pose, The Dilemmas of Black Manhood in America. And it takes a really good look at how young men pose and how it shows up and what mental health clinicians can do to really have a better understanding of what's happening to young men and behavior. And especially is centered around this concept of behaviorally posturing, so that you feel safe. And a lot of what I've learned in my work is that my sons did a lot of things to feel safe, to protect themselves. This is how they protected themselves from a lot of things. My son said something that really framed it up for me. So I had this bias too that, you know what, I have a big home, I have a little bit of money, and I have a whole lot of love. And I thought that that would be all that I needed to shape my sons and turn them into men, because that was my main focus. I wanted them to become something they didn't see. Well, now they see it, so there's no excuse. They have a home, so now there's no excuse. They have a person that cares about them. There's no excuse, right? And I believed that that was all it took. And one of my sons said to me, I said to him, "Why do you act this way when you leave off of our front porch and go? And why are you always getting in trouble?" And one of the things he said, "Dad, when I jump off this front porch, everything that I now have to do is centered around protecting my identity. When I'm at home, I can smile, I can laugh, but when I hit these streets, it's going to be something completely different, and I have to be able to survive out there, right?" And I remembered that when I was a boy. But when I became a man, right, these are some of the things that I didn't often really think about because I provided a space. I provided a safe space, right? And oftentimes I tried to provide a psychological safe space too, right? But I often realized that I was struggling in these spaces as well. And when he shared that with me, that really shaped it up for me too. It shaped it up for me when he showed up to the office to meet with his therapist, and he didn't smile. He wasn't laughing. He they didn't get to see the kid that I saw. And I often wonder, how did that show up in his care? How did the clinician support him when he didn't talk? He didn't say anything. He just looked grim-faced and unhappy, right? And one of the things that showed up for us when my sons often did that is that they weren't being compliant, right? They're not taking therapy serious. But I had to understand that that wasn't it, that a lot of this was really centered around how they pose to feel protected. Another big picture to this story too is talking about the concept of masculinity and how that shapes and the impact that that has on what it means to really be a man in many of our cultures. And young men in particular, when we talk about, again, how do I become something I don't see, there is a dominance in their culture that tells us what they ought to become and how they ought to become it and what they ought to be to become real men, right? And what we know to be true oftentimes is feelings and emotions don't fit into that framework for many of our young men. So when we think about providers and their characteristics, this is one of the really most important pieces too. What I hear from young men and fathers oftentimes is what they want is for systems to recognize you do represent a system. So if you do represent this system, it's really important to realize that you need to keep it real as that. And I'll describe what that means. They have to trust you and your style matters. Keeping it real means language. You would be surprised how many folks in our space use language that many people don't understand. Excuse me. It took me a really long time to understand all of the acronyms that were associated to the criminal justice system. It was a language in itself. Medical, it's a language in itself. Our community mental health, it's a language in itself, and oftentimes, and not many people don't know how to speak the language, right? And so, what we have to do is be open to listening and teaching people the language, but meeting people where they're at. What's also important is that as your expertise and qualifications does matter too. Young people are looking for that. They are paying attention to how you show up. Men and fathers often talk about when they have had opportunities where they enter into a space, they are observing all of these things. They can tell when you're BS, and that's part of their survival mode is to be able to read people really well too, right? And so, quite oftentimes than not, what we don't often do is give a lot of these young men a lot of credit for their ability to see it as it is, right? So they can tell if you're fearful. They can tell if you're sizing them up. They can tell if they feel like you don't see them or hear them. They can they recognize that, right? And I think that's really important because I think sometimes we don't think that they do. And one of the things that's key too is whether or not you are a service provider and you happen to not look like the person that you're providing services for. All of these things still are applicable. You can still connect with people, but you have to also be relatable, right? And these are the things that young people are saying when they meet with you. I think these are universal things. Be genuine, act with warmth, and share a little of yourself, right? There's often this concept that, you don't share too much, right? But it's really important to share something. We are looking for community. Men are saying to me too, I'm going to go into a space and they want me to unpack all of this, but is this a safe space? And the interesting thing is that men are asking that too. Particularly the men that I serve, particularly the men that I serve with that are experiencing depression, that are experiencing anxiety, that are experiencing all of the things that you can think of when you think about our systems. They want to know if they can be safe too. When it comes to style, it says talk to the clients like they're people, understand where your clients are coming from, and ask and share what you're writing and listening to. Excuse me, ask and share what you're writing when listening. That is so important. I can't tell you how many times I've been in spaces where I've shared, here's what I'm writing, or I'm not writing at all, or I might say, can I write this down? And then share what I'm writing. I think it's really, really important, again, when we talk about building connection and building um, an alliance with people, they have to be able to see this and experience this. No one wants to walk into a room and someone is instantly writing things down, right? The goal is to connect. I love this quote. It says, communities of color are no different than any other community that everyone wants to live a healthy life, physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. The challenge for communities of color and healthcare providers alike is defining what a healthy community looks like. And I think that the only way to really truly define that is that you have to also be hearing from your stakeholders. And those are the people that you're giving, that are, receiving services from you, right? And so I have had I've spent a lot of time looking at people's what do they call your pillars, your values, and your mission statement. And what also is really not surprising to me, but surprising to me, is when I sit in a room and I ask folks, well, what is your mission and vision? What are the pillars of your organization and your agency? You'd be surprised how many times people don't often know those, right? And so the thing is that there are a lot of people that are going into these for services and actually are reading what your mission is, and paying attention to how that mission shows up in their experiences with the person that they're receiving that service from. So I think it's really key to understand what your mission and your vision is, and that you should be working very closely with the folks that you are providing this service to get that feedback, and do something with that feedback whether when it shows up, because I think healthy communities start with people working collaboratively together. And my experience in this space as a father raising 8 sons through all these systems is I started to notice that many systems and agencies were not working together as much as they were operating out of silos. And the challenge with that was that I found myself constantly in agencies and organizations sharing my story over again, getting a referral form from an organization and agency, being told to contact someone from this agency, and this person is no longer works there. Right. So constantly having to get on the road and tell my story over and over again. Right. One of the big things I'll shout out, if you're in this space, I'm shouting you out, is wraparound services. Wraparound services really helped redefine how I looked at um, organizations who provided mental health support, because they brought all those services directly to me and my family, and that made an amazing difference for us, especially when it came to providing support. Right. One of the other things that I often think about is being innovative. Right. And sometimes we're really scared of doing things that don't align with what is the norm. But I think when we're listening to our stakeholders, when we're listening to our community will tell us what they need. And I think that's really also important when we're doing this work, specifically when we're talking about young people of color who are connected to villages, right? And community and family and spirituality, all is baked into that cultural connection piece, right? We have to meet people where they're at. And so we often have to be able to provide services in an innovative way. And so this is myself and my barber. And so one of the things that we did is we provided a training to barbers, and we titled them mental wellness coaches. And what we discovered is that so many of our young men that we wanted to connect with were going to their barber. And their barbers were also collecting the stories of the traumas that these young men were experiencing over time. And what we also discovered too is so many of our barbers in our salons in our communities, the people that are in these spaces are also experiencing secondary trauma, because they're also starting to collect those trauma stories, right? And then as I started to talk to the barbers and the men and women in the salons, what we also discovered is that they didn't have the mental health tools. They also did not have the proper insurances to take care of their own mental health. Right. And so then we started paying attention to what was happening to barbers, what was happening to stylists and salons, when we talk about people of color and communities of color. And we started to notice that they were also suffering, and they didn't get the support that they needed as well. And so this was one of those projects that I think is really, again, when we talk about being innovative, when we talk about connecting, when we talk about listening, these are some of the things that can come from that. And so, what do you see? Right? In your work, what do you see? And so one of the things I just want to again echo when we talk about cultural factors that influence substance use treatment outcomes, one of the things that shows up is recognizing the historical trauma and systemic racism and how that plays and shapes these outcomes. The strong family and community ties affects it. Spirituality and religious beliefs, masculinity norms in Black culture also can impact some of these outcomes. And again, social economic factors that and limited access to resources. Again, that is a constant thing for so many of our young people, and fathers as well, is that they don't have the resources. And I'm working with fathers who are fathers that are not in the home of the child, right? And so oftentimes than not, these fathers don't have housing, they don't have a variety of things. And they also are expected to be able to do a list of things without recognizing that they're also struggling too. And so oftentimes than not, the work that I'm now doing is really around when we talk about identity theory, is really helping some of the men that I serve that are incarcerated, who are recovering, really talk about their roles as dads and how important that role is. Right. So some of the things that you can do, right? It says developmental considerations for tailoring some of the treatment approaches. So when we think about Black boys in their adolescence, one of the things you can focus on is identity formation. I heard earlier on in the chat, mentorship. Mentorship is key for young men. They are looking, they are watching, they are trying to find themselves. Identity is important, so they will become what they start to look at, and who influences them by those connections. Their peer influences is key. So these are some of the things I think that also when we're working with young men that we also can support their parents around. And having a trauma-informed care lens, that was something I did not have. It took, oh my gosh, I think I started care supporting my sons in 2008. Now, mind you, I'd already had a son. I was a young single father, and so that's why I work with young dads. But I can tell you, I don't remember having a trauma-informed lens well until I was in my late 20s, probably early 30s before I got trauma trained. And I think it was a aha moment across the board when I realized, oh man, I'm on a hamster wheel with my children. Their trauma is impacted my trauma. We're just running around traumatized, and no one in the space has a trauma-informed lens. And then what's interesting about that is that my sons have been in therapy, many of them since they were 8 years old. Now they're now 13, 14, 15. And even then, they didn't have a lens or the language to even talk about trauma in a real way that made sense to them, right? And so I think that's really key. But this is really important, but their peer influences were huge. Their identity connections were big, right? And so these were the things that I had to learn to align with to support them. Young men addressing masculinity and cultural expectations. Oh, bro, man, all of these things that you see here are really important when we think about the different approaches that you can take to provide services across these life stages. One of the things I think is also important that we have to move past is the cultural disconnect, ignoring or dismissing cultural practices. I cannot tell you how many experiences I've had with practitioners where there's a belittling or ignoring cultural traditions and customs and values, or misreading them, right? Not having the right information or the training to really understand what they're seeing. Pressure to conform to mainstream standards, expecting Black boys to abandon aspects of their culture, cutting their hair, changing the way that they dress. All of these things have strong impacts on connection. I can't tell you how these things show up, right? And how they show up at court, how they show up at school, how they show up in these spaces, and the amount of people that will pass judgment without even realizing it, right? Just based off of some of these things that they look at, stereotyping and cultural misunderstandings, making assumptions, preferences, right, about the abilities and behaviors of young people, and all these things, right? The microaggressions, like these all play a role in how we support young people. And they also impact, right, how our young people find themselves with anxiety, depression, how they cope with it. So these things also are embedded in what we see happening to young men as well. This is a very close friend of mine, and I have permission to share this. And I thought this was really an important piece. He says, I'm more than an addict. Um, when I met him through a parenting program I was running, and he showed up with the mom, but his sons were involved in the juvenile justice system. When he showed up, he was recently released from prison, and he was asked to come to this group, not by anyone else, but by mom. And so he came to the class and he saw me in the class. And again, how do I become something I don't see? We think mentorship just stops with or is needed only by boys, and discovered that I'm 20, maybe I'm 32, he's 40, and he saw me as a mentor. Eventually, I went to court, became his mentor, um, mandated by a judge to walk alongside him as he recommended me to be in that space. And I tell you, it was life changing. And the only reason why I think I'm sharing this story is because of that statement. I'm more than an addict. And what we really started to work on is him being a father, and talking about the experiences that got in the way of him being able to be the best dad that he wanted to be. And so he talked a great deal about his substance use and how that impacted so much of his life, but how it also impacted his children, and how he just wanted to be a better father. And I can't tell you that, yes, he got into treatment and he worked in his treatment, but what we spent a lot more time talking about is his identity connected to fatherhood. And I think that's just really important, that for him, it was like, okay, I'm working on myself because I'm an addict, is what he called himself. But, we started to unpack, but you know what, bro, you're more than just an addict. You're a father, you're a partner, you're a parent. Like, we really had to identify what those roles were. And I think it reshaped. This is a picture of him and his son going to community college together. So he was a student in college the same time of his son. Right. And so I say, why use identity theory in treatment? For me, it's really about the story that I just shared. It's about really helping dads see that they're more than just, and that yes, they have made there's been some challenges and some really hardships that they've experienced along the way, when it comes to their sobriety and supporting their children or the lack thereof. But they are still dads, and these are the things that you can do to be a better, healthier father, to be a healthier co-parent, right? And so we started to recognize that there needs to be, when we talk about treatment, let's add on parenting if we have a father. Let's talk about the role of fatherhood. What does that look like? Um, and how can you do it? Because a lot of these dads, when they get into treatment and they find sobriety and they sober up, one of the things that they talk about is, the mistakes that they made as parents and as fathers and the hurt that comes with that. But nowhere in their treatment do they talk about how fatherhood and parenting and co-parenting was a part of the treatment too. Right. And so I think that's just important when I think about the work that I've been seeing serving fathers. And it says, so what do Black and brown young men need from us as adults? Here's what they report. They need cultural relevant curriculums. So when we think about the curriculums that we're going to be using when we're serving young men of color, we need to do our research. We need to be intentional about what we provide. When we talk about diverse perspectives, I'm even in my work right now, right? When we talk about Black boys, I am starting to ask really important questions. Are we talking about all Black boys, or are we talking about Black boys that make us feel safe? Right? Are we talking about Black boys that don't identify as heterosexual? Are we talking about Black boys that identify as trans? Are we talking about Black boys? Are we talking about non-binary? Are we talking? And how do we move from talking and being inclusive and making sure that we're finding the right material that really fits and aligns with the support that young people need? And I think that that makes a difference. I would even say to you, even creating this presentation was really centered around, here I am talking about Black boys and Black men, but how do I make sure that we're being gender sensitive and that we recognize that it's a larger spectrum than what we know. So I'm going to wrap us up. So one of the things that we talked a great deal about, that you talked about too in our chat, is positive role models. Connect boys of color, connect young people of color with mentors and role models that have the same cultural background and serve as inspirational speakers. This is so key. Trauma-informed care, right? Creating safe spaces and supportive environments for young people. There are a lot of spaces that are not safe for young men. But there are some safe havens. When we do the work, we find out one of those spaces can be with the support of a variety of people, that your barbershop, wherever young people go, we have to make sure that we're there and we're helping provide supportive services in those spaces. Um, I want to make sure that I'm conscientious of time. Um, and I want to be able to answer any questions that you have before we wrap up. And one of the things that I do is I have a lot of slides. I enjoy talking, if you haven't noticed already, so I could keep us going for another hour or two. But I'll stop here and just briefly talk about that. What is really important is this intersectionality, and that we recognize um, um, the importance of that there are a variety of ways that marginalized people have been affected and impacted, right? And it's really important that we recognize, when we talk about how we provide support for young people, is that we look at the whole person. And I think this is really, really key in the work that we do. And I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop here and open the floor for any questions, comments, thoughts before um, I let you all go. And if you're putting something in the chat, I'll see if I can grab that. Oh, I probably should put something up where if you wanted to, if you wanted to contact me, let me do that. Sorry. Sorry about that, y'all. I'm struggling to share my screen. Let's see. There is my contact information. There we go. If there are some questions on here that I did not get a chance to see, one of the things that I will do is respond by email and try my best to get that information or questions answered to you. So if there is something that pops up in the chat that I don't get it, because it looks like there's a couple things there, I will respond in email and get those answers to you. Thanks again, everybody.
Kind of went through the chat too. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous and great presentation. Not seeing any questions at the moment.
Okay.
Um,
I did see something about cultural programming, if young men of color were the minority. I think I saw that somewhere.
what recommendations do you have for implementing culturally appropriate care in communities where Black men are the minority population?
Yeah, I'd like to. Do we know who asked that question so I can
Let me get back to it.
recommendation?
Teresa Crosby.
Okay. It's a really good question too by Barb. Patients with private practice. What is the solution to losing therapists? It's a great question. Let's say I scan the QR code and I can connect. Does it say I can't connect? Teresa Crosby. Oh, you know what? Okay. Okay.
Right. So Teresa's gonna contact you
Okay.
off of here. So yeah, just a ton of thank yous, great presentation. I want to thank you again, Cole, for taking your time to be with us today and for sharing all this very important information. And thank you to all of you for attending this session. We hope you found the information Cole shared valuable. Today's presentation is one of many webinars scheduled throughout the month of September. To see information and register for additional sessions, please visit our website at www.sccmh.org. Before we wrap up, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. A survey link will pop up on your screen once you exit the webinar. We kindly ask that you take a few minutes to complete it. Your input is crucial in helping us improve future events and better meet your needs. For those of you that are requesting professional credits, please allow 2 to 3 weeks after the summit has concluded and your certificate will be emailed to you. Thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. And
Thank you.
thank you, Cole.
Thank you. Thank you.